Oh, we're back with Barbershop Sports Talk, and we have a very special guest with us today. We have David Ramil. He covers the Miami Heat and is the host of the Locked On Heat podcast. How you doing, David?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
So last time I had you on the podcast, we kind of talked a little bit about how all of this would work, right? With the bubble being in Disney, like the worldwide complex of sports. Kind of, what were your expectations of the bubble? And as you kind of saw the first couple rounds materialize, did it meet your expectations?
I think it exceeded them, to be honest with you. I think everything worked out so well, not just from a health perspective, but the level of play, the fact that they were able to get so much going offensively, and we have been surprised, I think, pleasantly, collectively, seeing how well these teams have been playing there. We thought after the long hiatus, maybe it would be a little difficult for players to get back into a rhythm, but that wasn't the case. The training camps and whatever necessary practices they had in order to get back into a rhythm show that they were just incredibly elite level athletes, and the basketball, I think, has been really, really great so far.
Now I've kind of heard this argument, and it's really interesting because the basketball, I feel like it's been really good. Like I've enjoyed it, and I think it's also interesting with everything being on a neutral court, like the weird things that happen. Like you can go to the Nuggets Jazz series, like the Nuggets Clippers series right now, like just how it's kind of how things have kind of made it a little bit more weird, but different, but weird and kind of entertaining in a good way. Would you be in favor if the NBA was just kind of like, okay, from now on, because they've been talking about experimenting with the playoffs anyway, maybe we do have a bubble format for the playoffs?
Yes, yeah. Actually, looking at it now, I mean, I don't think it'll ever happen just because of the kind of revenue that's generated from long playoff runs and certain teams. I mean, that's like you look at a team like maybe the Pelicans or another team that's just like maybe the Kings, the Sacramento Kings, teams that are clamoring for the opportunity to make the playoffs. And while they're probably not going to go on deep playoff runs, for them to be able to bring a quote-unquote playoff atmosphere back to their respective cities and their home arenas would probably be such a huge factor. And again, they'll be making some money off of that. So to me, I can't see how they just eliminate that sort of thing. But viewing the bubble the way we have and seeing the kind of level of success that we find out of it, I'd be 100% in support of such an idea. Expecting that hopefully you could, increase the number of people that could cover it and extend credentials to a number of different reporters and things like that sort. And assuming, again, that everybody's healthy and you can maintain the integrity of the bubble.
And even when you kind of look at even the Heat Buck series, like, do you feel like that series goes that way if it's a typical, right, 2 home, 2 away? Do you think it goes that way?
That's a tough one to say because I know Milwaukee typically very good at home and Miami conversely very bad on the road, and so you wonder whether or not they would have fallen apart a little bit. I think Miami has just been so strangely focused on the next level and winning a championship, and that's been their ultimate goal because that's just who they are as a franchise, and that's just the collection of players that they have on that roster are all thinks of winning a title from day one, regardless of anybody else has those expectations for them or not. So they're kind of ideally suited for the bubble. But, I mean, Milwaukee, there were moments there where they probably could have used more energy from the home crowd to kind of cheer them going, especially in late game situations where they kind of fell apart a little bit. And so if this series is being played in Milwaukee, they probably will win at least a couple games, and then that shifts the momentum of the series considerably. Miami might not close it out in 5 games. They might not win at all, even if they have the kind of right personnel to limit what the Bucks can do. And look, even from that perspective, officiating tends to gravitate towards home crowds as well. They get caught up in the emotions, they get caught up in the cheering, the loud clapping, etc., and all of a sudden they make a call that goes for the home team's favor. That changes the whole dynamic of a series.
How surprised were you that the Heat beat the Bucks in 5 games?
So they beat them in 5 games. Very surprised. I think a lot of people recognized that Miami was very well suited to contend against the Bucks. This was a roster specifically built to challenge Milwaukee, to build that wall against Giannis Antetokounmpo, and trust that everybody else was going to be able to defend Chris Middleton, Brook Lopez, etc. to a lesser degree. If anything, you look at how effective they were when Antetokounmpo was in the game, and conversely, the fact that they lost Game 4 when he was out, that when he was out in Game 5, Miami would challenge more by that roster because they were so specifically built to stop Giannis that when he was out of the game and they got great performances from Middleton Dante DiVincenzo and other players that were, specifically role players, Miami looked a little confused. They looked not as engaged and dynamic as they had during the first three games when they absolutely were just beating on Giannis and the Bucks. So I knew that they were going to find a way to win, and I just was surprised at how effective their strategy was and how well they were able to implement it against Giannis.
Well, and also, do you think we should have even been surprised that the Heat did this to the Bucks? Because if you kind of look in the first round, like the Heat beat the Pacers, they sweep them, and the Bucks they lose one game to Orlando, which was kind of very odd, and they didn't really look that great in that series against the Magic. Like the Bucks, they looked the worst out of any of the teams in the East in the first round. So do you think it was kind of like we should have been that shocked that this happened? Because the Bucks, they didn't look good in the first round.
No, you're absolutely right. But at the same time, it's just you can't expect that a team with the prohibitive MVP on the roster and that has another All-Star in Middleton, another one in Lopez, et cetera, that has the kind of talent and depth that they did. They were historically good during the regular season before the hiatus took place. So you don't expect them to fall apart. But even as they're kind of sleepwalking through the Orlando series, as you pointed out, that they're going to figure it out, that they're going to realize, we can turn that, and that they're good enough to do so. They didn't. And maybe some of that has to do on their personnel. Probably a lot of criticism goes towards Mike Budenholzer and his lack of making those kinds of adjustments. It's been a pretty steady, consistent criticism of him throughout his coaching career. So I think that's an issue too. I think the Bucks were really, really good. I never really wanted to discount them altogether, but they did not play as well as they had prior to the hiatus. And I think a lot of people even recognize that there were concerns that they just never really got it going, that maybe they lost momentum when the season ended in March, and that they might not be able to get it back together. And clearly, they never really did.
Now, when for you were you? Because I think everybody knows, like, the Heat believed that they were better than the Bucks the whole time, and that was kind of very obvious, right? But when were you kind of like, okay, they're just better? Like what game was it for you with the Heat and Bucks? Was it just like, okay, this isn't happening for Milwaukee? Like they're just overmatched.
It was game two because for them, for Miami to have won the way they did in game one, my feeling was, well, look, an incredible performance by Jimmy Butler, hit those free throws, etc. This is as good a game as you're going to get out of Jimmy. Maybe he tapers off. Maybe he's not as great in the next game. And sure enough, that's what happened. He was the kind of dynamic scorer he was in game one. It was a very, very different scoring approach from Miami, but they still beat them. Milwaukee had no answer for what Miami was able to do well. And because of that, I started to realize, this is working exactly as they had hoped it would. They had the right strategy. They had the right personnel. They made the tough decisions to bench Myers Leonard and Kendrick Nunn and keep them there out of the rotation, to insert Jay Crowder. And he's proven to be such a great factor in that starting lineup because he's such a great defender. He handled that challenge against Antetokounmpo individually and started off, at least defensively, and then, of course, everybody kind of switched on and helped defend to some extent. But, game two showed that Miami can beat Milwaukee in different ways, and from that point forward, I didn't think Milwaukee was going to have a response. You never want to get too cocky or too arrogant and assume that you're going to get a team as good as Milwaukee was prior to the hiatus is just going to get blown out. But they never really looked like they were capable of stepping up and making any changes to adjust to what Miami was doing so well.
In your time covering basketball, is there a series that's kind of close to this in terms of like just surprising you?
Wait, run that by me again?
And in your time covering basketball, has there ever been a series like the Bucks and the Heat that just kind of shocked you like this? Like, do they just the underdogs just destroy the favorites?
Not to this extent, no. I don't think. I mean, they were one seed. They were so good, and whether there was a right matchup or not, you still expect Milwaukee to find a way to win. So this was very, very different. I don't think we've ever seen any kind of team with an MVP player with the number one seed in the Eastern Conference to be outclassed so severely. So this has to rank up there. I can't think off the top of my head of any other series that has really challenged me. Look, several years ago with the Miami Heat, they were the one seed of the Eastern Conference, and they were beat by a New York Knicks team. But similarly, that Knicks team had been built by Pat Riley prior to him joining Miami, so there was a lot of similar personnel, very similar styles of play. It came down to the waning seconds of a Game 7, so there was obvious, similarity between those two teams, and even though they were 1-8, they were much more closely aligned than you would have thought. But nothing like this. Two different teams, a one seed with an MVP, as historically good as they were, for them to get knocked out. This is probably as surprising a series as I've ever seen.
And the most interesting thing about this is I think you could make an argument that Jimmy Butler is the best player left in the Eastern Conference playoffs, and he's not typically a guy that when you say, right, the best player on a Final Four team, Jimmy Butler doesn't, come to mind. It's usually guys like LeBron, like a Kawhi, a Giannis, guys like that. So do you kind of think, how good is Jimmy Butler in reality? Because I think there's a lot of kind of debate about this in the NBA community. Would you say he's like in that top 10?
Probably just outside of that. And it's unfair because, the thing is with Jimmy versus some of those other players that might be in that quote-unquote top 10 is that Jimmy doesn't have to produce offensively the way that other of those players do in order to warrant that high rank. Jimmy he does everything well. Like, he's an underrated playmaker. He's a superlative, defender. He's a guy who can control the flow of the game by getting to the line as often as he does, more than any other player other than James Harden. And so when you look at that, like, Jimmy just is a really, really, really good player. He just doesn't he doesn't average 25 points per game. He doesn't put up huge scoring nights the way he did in Game 1. That was a very atypical performance for him. And somehow, he still finds a way to win. He still finds a way to get the most out of everybody. And he's been a perfect fit in Miami in that you do have other complementary scorers, other guys that can step up and take up the bulk of the scoring load. And so it works very well. You just got a guy like him who makes plays for others and just has a feel for what to get everybody else's games. And it's funny you bring up that point that he might be the best player in the Eastern Conference, because I just answered that question with somebody else on another podcast, comparing him to Jason Tatum. And while Tatum is the better scorer, I still like what Butler can do outside of that. And Tatum's a great defender, but Butler as a playmaker, Butler's ability to control the pace on offense by getting to the line and slow things down so that Miami can catch a breath and reassert themselves if ever an opponent is kind of closing in there, I have to give the edge to Jimmy.
Okay, why did Jimmy leave Philadelphia? Like, do you think it was more because you can tell, like, Jimmy's loving it in Miami, just like the way they work, just the way they go about business. Do you think it was more of that, or do you think it was more that maybe what guys like Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons kind of weren't, right? Because it seems like he loves guys like Robinson and then Tyler Hero, Jay Crowder. Like, he loves those guys. Like, he just loves it.
A little bit of both, honestly. I think Philadelphia might not have wanted Jimmy back there. Like, they didn't want the Jimmy that they had for the few months that they were there, because there was some obvious tension between him and Ben Simmons and maybe some of the other members of the coaching staff and things of that sort. So there was absolutely tension there. Conversely, Jimmy had heard from Dwayne Wade during their time together in Chicago how much of a great he was in Miami, and we see that. Like, his commitment to work, the fact that everybody on this roster commits themselves so completely, we knew it was going to be a pretty solid pairing. I didn't expect. I was probably higher on the connection than most, and I had been for a long time after I talked to him, even before when he was in Minnesota. I brought this up before on my own show, but talking to him in Minnesota and hearing him talk about Andrew Wiggins and knowing that Wiggins had all the talent in the world, but the thing that was missing with him was the commitment to the work and getting better, etc. I heard that, and I'm thinking to myself, man, this is a player who talks exactly the way that he coaches in front office do. That as long as you continue to work hard, you'll find a way to get better and get to the top somehow. And so hearing that, I knew he was a great fit in Miami. I just didn't expect that he was going to get the most out of everybody on this roster so easily and so quickly. That Bam had all this talent, that was pretty obvious. I didn't know that it was going to tie together and that Jimmy would defer to him as often as he has. This is another superstar level player in Butler who's getting paid a max contract, and he's been very consistent all season long in saying, Bam's our best player. Why is it that I'm the best player? Why do you think I'm the best player? And he's told this to media a number of times. Why isn't it Bam? He's gone out of his way to compliment Tyler Hero, a rookie, to point out that Kendrick Nunn has all the potential in the world, to form a friendship with Goran Dragic, and mentioned a number of times what a tough competitor is. He's just been such a great locker room presence that it's just worked out really well. And so he needed that kind of commitment to excellence, and he wanted to be here. Like, that's the thing that we always kind of discount, is that, look, he was traded from Chicago to Minnesota. That wasn't his choice. traded from Minnesota to Philadelphia. Again, not his choice, but he chose to come to Miami, and that's been all the difference in the world.
And when you kind of talk about tension with him and Ben Simmons, why doesn't that tension ever exist in Miami? Do you think it's just the personalities?
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been any player there that's rubbed him the wrong way. Like, one of the things that we've heard a lot about from this team throughout the whole season is accountability. And I don't think that ever took place in Minnesota or in Philadelphia. Like, they never wanted to hear from Jimmy, you need to do better. And that's the thing that is welcomed in Miami. He can get at the Bam's face and vice versa, and he can say, look, you could have handled that defensive assignment better. You need to be more aggressive. You need to go and put up your shot. Like he said it to Duncan Robinson, a guy who turned into one of the best shooters in the league. He said, no, you're open. Take that damn shot. And Duncan can handle it. Like, Duncan can respond and say, you're right. I need to do better. I needed to be more aggressive on offense. And nobody bristles when Jimmy kind of gets into the face and challenges them. And I think that's, it's been welcomed. And, again, they have the open door to be able to do the same thing to him. I can't recall what game it was. I want to say it was game one where he had that incredible performance. Giannis has him. A guy who doesn't even play anymore yells expletives at Jimmy Butler and says, do not let us lose this game. And Butler responds and has an incredible performance. So that's the kind of thing that I think is welcomed in Miami that might not be in other teams.
And when I imagine, like, the Heat's practice, and I don't know if you can attest this, I just imagine just, like, the most intense practices you ever see. Like, guys almost fighting each other, like, guys MFing each other the whole time. Like, just kind of, the old saying, like, iron sharpens iron. Is that kind of how it's like in Miami?
Well, honestly, those are closed off, so we don't really get a sense of that. But I think it's probably not that kind of tension. You get competitive. These guys all want to win and perform at a high level, and they like being challenged. There's a lot of trash talking, but it's also good-natured in the sense that they recognize that that's trying to get them to be better players individually. So it's not like Ben Simmons or even a Joel Embiid or a Karl Anthony Towns. Those guys, they were trying so hard to get a footing, to establish their names and reputation in the league, and for an established veteran like Jimmy to come in there and challenge them. They probably resented it because they're like, oh, why is this guy challenging me and kind of talking smack and making me feel like less of a player, less of a person. In Miami, they've all gone through such a difficult journey to get to this point. When you look at Duncan Robinson, who, was undrafted and was a player who didn't get a lot of play called for him at the University of Michigan, was a divisional series player to start his college career, and all this. Kendrick Nunn wasn't drafted. Jimmy Butler was a low draft pick. Bam Adebayo was on the bench for the last 2 seasons behind Hassan Whiteside, etc. There's so many guys in this roster with a chip on their shoulder. They kind of like it.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree with you there. How surprised have you kind of been of guys like a Tyler Hero? Because I know we kind of saw this with Tatum a couple of years ago, but a lot of the times you don't see young players, rotational, starter, otherwise, be able to play consistent minutes in the playoffs and be productive. And, like, they trust a guy like Tyler Hero to have the ball in his hands. Like, he closes games for them. Like, how surprised are you that he's developed this far?
That's been a huge development for him because, we've only had the 1-year sample size from the time in Kentucky. But the more we keep hearing about him throughout the regular season, even prior to the hiatus, was that he was just as hard a worker as possible, that he likes these kind of situations. And Eric Spoelstra is fond of saying, we've got a lot of guys in that locker room that live for these moments, and Tyler's one of them. He used to say the same thing about Dion. He says it about Jimmy, who's always been a big clutch player. But I think Tyler he's gone to a different level. And the hiatus also has been a very big positive for him, strangely enough, in that he took that time off while the season was pretty much ended to continue to work on his game. So this is not really a rookie season, although it's an extension of it. This is supposed to be his second season, and he's taken a huge leap. He's just much more aggressive, much more confident, and he didn't need much more of a boost as far as his confidence is concerned, but he's certainly been there's a feel for the game that we didn't see prior to the hiatus. His playmaking ability has taken another level. So for him, this was always going to happen. It was just a matter of when, and it's happened probably a little sooner than we expected, but he's always been a very confident, capable player in his short tenure here. And again, that work that defines everybody in that Miami Heat roster, he embraces it. He's put in so much of that effort, and I think Jimmy and other guys recognizing that he's not treated the same way other rookies around the league are. There's a lot of confidence in his ability to step up. Even older veterans like Goran Dragic and Myers Leonard, guys with a lot of experience, they tend to come up big and cut situations. And it's proven to be a good assessment on their part.
Now, with the Heat now in the conference finals, are going to play the Celtics. How do you see that series going? Right, we have game one. That's Tuesday, right? Game one's Tuesday. How do you see that game going? That series?
The more I talk about it, and I've talked about it a lot today, let me tell you, it is very, very difficult to assess because both teams coach very well. Both teams, incredible defensive intensity, great shooting, great scorers, great playmakers, versatile defenders, versatile scorers. It's just, they kind of mirror each other to some degree. And so it's very, very hard to make an exact prediction. Now, a lot of people assess Boston's roster and those switchable wings like Brown and Tatum, and recognize that they're very, very good. And even, of course, if Hayward is able to come back in a game 2 or game 3 and make an impact that way, then that changes what that roster looks like. But Miami, they've made some changes too, and they look really, really good against Milwaukee because of the acquisition of Crowder and Iguodala, guys who can come off the bench for Crowder's be starting and make that defense much more tenacious than it was during the regular season. So it's hard to really make any kind of accurate prediction or to guess exactly what's going to happen. I think from Boston's standpoint, they're going to try to get Kemba Walker going early on, and it's how Miami responds to being able to limit Walker. And who Adebayo starts off guarding, I think, is a huge factor because Adebayo or Daniel Tice makes sense because they're both playing the center position. But you could see Crowder switching on to Tice because he's strong enough to handle that responsibility, and at the same time putting Adebayo on a guy like Brown to start that matchup. And then having everybody kind of switch and make things uncomfortable for their shooters. If you can push Tatum away from the three-point line, get him out of his comfort zone, maybe have him stretch the floor a little bit more than he'd like. Maybe you can shut down some of his scoring, or you're not going to shut him down completely, but just to make things uncomfortable for him are a huge factor. And then you've got a guy like Duncan Robinson, probably not a great defender, so you're going to be targeted by what Boston can do. At the same time, who starts off guarding him? Is it Kemba Walker? Is it Marcus Smart? Is it Tatum or Brown? And those guys have to do so much work chasing after Duncan Robinson because he comes off of so many multiple screens where he's running constantly around the court and their half-court offense that either you're going to have somebody who's a primary defender on him to challenge what he does, or if you're constantly switching, you're going to have a moment there where you're going to make a mistake, where somebody doesn't switch as quickly as they should, and then you're either going to create a dribble handoff situation with Bam Adebayo where he can get an open look from the perimeter, and if that's the case, Duncan's been able to knock those down consistently all year, or you're going to have a double team on Robinson, which is to leave somebody open in another scenario, either a good roller like Adebayo or another perimeter shooter like Dragic or Crowder, who can knock down the three and has done so at such a high level during the Orlando bubble. So there's a lot of questions there. I mean, it's not to take away anything from what Boston has done. They've been really, really good. They've been challenged, and they played really well against a great Toronto team. But this is not a version of the Heat that they've faced before. They have not faced Jimmy Butler in all of his prime, the way we've seen from the playoffs so far. He was not there during the seeding games when these two teams met up. Similarly, when the two teams faced prior to that in January, they didn't have Crowder. They didn't have Iguodala. They didn't have Bam in the starting lineup. So this is a very, very strange rotation. And, yeah, you can take out as much film as you want to break it down. That's a whole other thing to compete against them, to play against them, and see how you respond.
So what would your prediction be for the series? Like, would you say Heat in 7?
I actually said Heat in 6. And mostly I've been saying that just because I said that against the Bucks and I said that against the Pacers, and so I'm kind of being a little bit superstitious and saying Heat in 6. It could go either way. I know that's probably a little bit more vague than you want to hear, but that's the reality. A lot can shift in Boston's favor very quickly. If they win a game early on, let's say they split the first 2 games for whatever reason, and then Hayward comes back and adds another dynamic to that rotation, that could change things in Boston's favor so heavily. And if you can't stop Kemba Walker, if Jason Tatum explodes for a big 40-point outing, maybe Ben gets into foul trouble for whatever reason. Those things, as small as they might seem, could really, really change the course of a game, which it could change the course of a series. It could go 5 games, it goes 7. I really think it's going to be a longer series for the 6. I could see just as easily either one of those teams coming down to a game 7. If that's the case, if it comes down to one single play or a bad foul call, a lot of that has really, really impacted certain games during the bubble. So, I mean, it's the playoffs. This is the moment that you live for if you're a player and as a fan.
Yeah, no, and I think Miami Boston. I think that is going to be a great series. Now, I do have to ask you this, and there was kind of a lot of talk about this because the Heat have been one of the teams that is rumored, so called, right? If Giannis ends up leaving Milwaukee, what are the chances that Giannis would go to the Heat?
I think they're great, honestly. I think it comes down to whether or not he chooses to leave Milwaukee, but if he does, I don't think why he would pick Miami. Not only is there a connection there in that Bam Adebayo was represented by the same agent as Giannis is, there's clearly something there, and I think that agent knows firsthand Bam how good that culture is, how good they take care of their players, how much they push you to get to that next level. And you look at his level of frustration in that last series when they were beat by this Miami team that doesn't have a quote-unquote superstar. Maybe you can make an exception for Jimmy in that case, but they don't have the same level of talent maybe as other of these contending teams. And somehow they just continue to play hard. They're always well-defined. Everybody on that roster knows their role on this team, and that has to be appealing to a player like Antetokounmpo who's looking for another level to take his game personally and as a team too. If you want to achieve something to establish a long-lasting legacy as a player, he might be looking for championships early on. And that's the case. Miami has experience taking superstar players and have to look no further than 2010 and LeBron James, and they have the experience of being able to take these players, get them to develop even further than they already are, whether that's extending his range a little bit as an outside shooter or finding some new wrinkle in his offense that makes him a better playmaker for others. Something is going to happen where Miami feels comfortable knowing that they can take Giannis and add him to this team and make him an even better version of the player that we've already seen. And I think that has to appeal to a lot of people. And if you look at Miami's history, not just with Pat Riley over the last 25 years, but recent history, they've gone meetings with Gordon Hayward, they've gone meetings with Kevin Durant, they've gone meetings with Marcus Aldridge, and of course they were able to acquire Jimmy Butler. So they get big names, they get big meetings with big time players. And I think once you're in a room with Pat Riley and the rest of that front office, they're going to make a hell of a pitch, and they're going to do their best to convince you to join them. It might not always work, but it's going to get you thinking. And once you start thinking about Miami and being able to play here as a superstar that can win a championship right away, because there's an established culture here that can win titles, that has to be appealing. So, I mean, I would say that Antetokounmpo, if he's entertaining ideas of going elsewhere, Miami is probably the premier destination.
Now, that was a great pitch. That was a great pitch. I love it. Now, do you think, though, because I've also heard this argument, right, and it's kind of the Kevin Durant there, people are like, would he really go to the team that beat him in 5 games? And then everybody's like, well, Kevin Durant kind of did the same thing. Do you actually think that could happen, though, because of that, or do you think that would play almost no factor?
I don't think it would be as big a factor as you think. But I also think that it's going to happen this offseason. So much of next season is up in the air, regardless of where the rest of the country is, the rest of the world. But let's assume that they start playing with some kind of clear timeline within the next few months. I think they want to give it another chance there. I think they want to see whether or not they can run it back for a 3rd consecutive season, and maybe that'll turn out into a title or at least a deeper playoff run than we've seen. And if that's the case, that changes things a lot. From right now, he's under contract. It's not like Miami's going to trade for him because they'd have to give up a whole heck of a lot, more than they probably have in order to acquire him. The plan is, and has been for a long time, is to wait until he's a free agent. And that depends on whether or not he turns down his max level extension. And if that's the case, then he becomes a free agent. And then that's it. From there, it's an open floor. And you hope that, again, as a Miami team, you hope that you can get a meeting with him, make the kind of pitch that you think will change his mind, and then you'll probably be able to lock down your superstar with a max level contract here in South Florida. Where, again, if you're looking at the dollars thing, the fact that you don't pay state income, while you might be able to get more money per se in Milwaukee, it evens out. And once you come to Miami, you won't be paying those taxes at some level. And so you'd probably be making the same amount of money in South Florida, plus you're in South Florida as opposed to Milwaukee, plus you have an established championship culture too that we don't have in Milwaukee. So there's a lot of, so I think it's going to happen this summer, unless this meeting that we're hearing so much about over the last few days, people were about Giannis demanding a trade. I don't think that's the case. I think he's just pushing ownership for changes and changes to the roster when the current ownership wants to keep Mike Budenholzer in place as the head coach. And while he's clearly struggling in the playoffs over the last couple of seasons, he's still a really good coach that he's built probably for the regular season. I would expect Cooper to be under the contract and on that roster there moving forward next season. But after that, who knows?
Well, I definitely think Pat Riley, at the very least, will get a meeting with Giannis next summer. I would definitely bet money on that. David, thank you for coming on the podcast, man. I appreciate it.